Hello everyone. Before we start, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is for you. That's how YouTube keeps sending you stories like this. And now let's get into it. I grew up in a small mountain town nestled high in the Swedish north called Kiruna, a place where everyone knew one another. The welcome sign at the entrance of the town stated that the population did not exceed 1,500 residents, but that number felt much smaller when you actually lived there. The town was built around an old mine, with a rugged rural road cutting right through its center. There was a single grocery store, a gas station with a small corner selling hot fast food, a hardware store that also supplied skiing and hunting gear, and a single school building housing all grade levels, separated by long hallways and metal lockers painted in faded colors. The air always carried the scent of pine mixed with heating fuel during the summer, and the smell of burning firewood and damp earth in the winter. I remember November of 1994 with brutal clarity, a clarity that makes thinking about it painful even today. That was the winter before everything in our town degraded, before people changed and houses locked their doors. Back then, life had a slow, gentle rhythm. Trucks passed through the town, but not too often, and the snow fell in a quiet, peaceful silence. The nights felt incredibly long, but safe, and most residents left their front doors unlocked. The greatest dangers we feared were sudden black ice on the roads or reindeer leaping out in front of cars in the pitch darkness. There was a boy in town named Oliver Nielsen. That wasn't a pseudonym. It was the kind of name that echoed constantly in local cafes, church halls, and daily school attendance rolls. Oliver was 14 years old, but looking at him, you would never believe his age given his extremely frail physique. He stood barely 1.25 meters tall and weighed no more than 30 kilograms, even in his heaviest winter clothes. He bought his jackets from the children's section because adult sizes hung off him like a vast tent. He walked quickly with short, rapid strides, like a toddler trying to keep up with an elder. His face looked much younger than his years, rounded cheeks and soft features. But his eyes, my God, they told a completely different story. They were sharp yet exhausted all at once, as if he were scanning everything while looking at nothing in particular. Oliver had Asperger's syndrome. Most of the townspeople didn't know the difference between it and classic autism. All they knew was that his mind worked a bit differently from other children. Honestly, we all loved him for it. He was completely genuine. If he was happy, his joy radiated clearly. If he was confused, he said so without hesitation. And if a room became too loud or the lights too bright, he would quietly withdraw outside, pressing his palms against his ears, closing his eyes, and breathing deeply, as if trying to keep his small world from collapsing. At school, everyone treated him like a younger brother, not out of pity, but because even the teachers knew his home life was an unbearable hell without anyone having to voice the bitter truths out loud. We would see blue bruises on his arms, always dismissed as accidental trips, clothes reeking of stale smoke and mildew, and a profound hunger evident in the way he sneaked near the lunch line early every day. His mother, Elena Nielsen, was the kind of woman who smiled with an excessive, fake sweetness in public, but would explode like a taut wire behind closed doors. Her husband spent most of his time drinking, surrendered to a perpetual stupor. As for his older sister, she fled the house and left town the moment she turned 18, never looking back. Oliver would get himself into trouble on purpose sometimes, mostly small things, pulling the school fire alarm, spray painting the town hall fences, overturning trash cans at 3 a.m, or climbing the old water tower, just to panic people. It felt as though he was begging anyone at all, to care enough to stop him, to draw a line for him, to truly see him and understand his suffering. But no one was harsh with him. Not the local police chief, nor the principal, nor the neighbors. We had all tacitly and silently agreed to treat him with gentleness because we knew he never received any of it home. He was genuinely cherished, the kind of child to whom neighbors brought extra hot soup on brutal winter days, gave rides to, waved at in the street, and slipped candy into his pockets without him even asking. His favorite color was a bright neon fluorescent green, not a calm, grassy shade, but that glaring green of highlighter pens. His backpack was bright green, his pencil case was green, and even his shoelaces. He once told the art teacher that this green felt like warmth rather than just a color the eye could see, and we all just nodded because that was Oliver. He said things that made no sense at first until you reflected on them and realized they struck the absolute core of the truth. During the final school week before the Christmas holidays, winter struck the town with unusual severity. Snow accumulated to towering heights around the houses, and sharp icicles dangled from rooftops like pointed daggers for much longer than usual. The river froze completely in sections that had never frozen in previous years. Some homes still relied on wood stoves for heat, so the smoke rising from the chimneys twisted into slow, gray spirals all day long. The cold felt heavy, like a breath trapped in our chests. Oliver arrived at school sick that Monday. It was clear he was suffering deeply, as his nose ran constantly, his small lips looked slightly blue, and his tiny hands shook without stopping. He wore 2 woolen sweaters under a very thin coat that was utterly unfit for such polar weather. Every step he took seemed like a grueling effort beyond his strength, yet his mother had insisted on sending him to school. Worse still, she had locked the front door after he left, leaving him homeless should he return early. By Tuesday morning, Oliver had completely vanished. His bright green backpack was found inside his school locker. It was open and half-packed, as if he fully intended to return shortly. His asthma inhaler was there, his math book, and his green pencil case with its edges chewed raw from pure anxiety. But there was no sign of Oliver. The school administration called his mother repeatedly, but there was no answer. The police chief drove to the Nielsen home and knocked forcefully on the door, but no one answered. We all initially assumed he had run away. Teenage runaways in November were not rare, and small towns always hoped these runaways would end up somewhere warm and safe, perhaps with relatives in another city. But Oliver was a creature of meticulously organized routine, and he was not the type to flee or disappear without a carefully mapped-out plan. Weeks dragged into weeks, and the ice would melt slightly only to freeze over again with even greater hostility. Everyone spoke of him in whispers and muted tones, as if speaking aloud would make things worse. Posts on local social media pages said things like, "Missing, but likely somewhere safe. Send your warm prayers. Check your sheds and barns just in case." People clung to hope like a lifeline in a deluge. Then January of 1995 arrived, and Oliver had been gone from sight for nearly 6 full weeks. The school organized voluntary search parties. These weren't orders from the police, but rather feelings of love and responsibility moving the hearts of the townspeople. Men searched abandoned logging trails, women inspected distant summer cabins, and teenagers poked around old barns and garages. The faded green posters bearing his face began to erode and dissolve under the weight of rain and snow. No one openly accused his mother, Elena, but everyone began to notice the strange, suspicious silence surrounding her. The silence of a mother who never panicked, never begged for help, and was never seen trembling with fear at the police station demanding updates. On a freezing afternoon in mid-January, someone finally uncovered the horrific truth. That man was Kurt Hallberg, who was checking empty rental properties to ensure they hadn't suffered damage from the frost and winter. One of these houses had sat vacant for over a year. Dusty windows, a backyard buried under mounds of dead leaves, and a stone chimney that hadn't felt fire since the last tenants departed. Kurt climbed the ladder to the roof to check if wild birds had built nests in the vents, and it was there that he inhaled an incredibly foul odor. It wasn't the usual smell of dead animals, rotting wood, or old insulation. It was a deeper, heavy, and nauseatingly pungent stench. Realizing something was terribly wrong, he called the police immediately. The police sent a large team to the site. There were no fire trucks or blaring sirens, for everyone in town felt at that exact moment that something had broken forever on this day. Oliver had attempted to enter the vacant house through the rooftop stone chimney opening. The most maddening and tragic part of it was that he was incredibly close to succeeding due to his tiny size. The top opening was wide enough, but old chimneys are built in a way that narrows progressively as they go down. They are not straight walls. They are funnels and lethal traps for small bodies that lack a plan for escape. Oliver had slipped inside, thinking warmth awaited him at the bottom, thinking an empty space meant safety from the harshness of the street, and thinking that climbing down was easier than facing doors barred in his face. Perhaps he wasn't thinking of anything at all except that hiding inside, whatever the cost, was far better than freezing in the polar cold outside. Despite his small size, he was still too large for that narrow brick funnel. Oliver got stuck in the middle, his shoulders and small ribs wedged halfway down. No one heard him screaming and begging because the thick brick swallowed the sound entirely, and the winter wind was howling outside louder than any cry for help. No footsteps passed near that abandoned house that day, and it never crossed the mind of any adult to look inside a chimney. Not to look for a child, at least. It took long weeks before death claimed him. The cold and sealed chimneys does not kill quickly in the absence of smoke or fire. There was no smoke, only brutal, icy nights, a slow freeze draining life drop by drop, and rough brick walls embracing him harshly, tightening around him every time he tried to shift his body to adjust his position. There was nothing but sickness, silence, and absolute isolation. I find myself constantly thinking of his small lungs burning with freezing air instead of smoke, of his cheek resting against the frozen brick, and of his frail body slowly surrendering to death, while neighbors slept peacefully just a few meters away from him. The tragedies of small towns do not scream aloud. They freeze in absolute silence, inch by inch. The aftermath that followed the discovery was harsher on us than the initial shock. It wasn't about the gruesomeness of the scene, but the terrifying reality that this beacon of purity and innocence had turned into a lifeless corpse. The town fractured into successive stages of grief and ached like silent dominoes. Shock, followed by absolute silence, followed by denial that quickly mutated into a raging anger. A raging anger that found no place or person to vent itself upon. The school closed its doors and suspended classes for a full day, followed by an entire week of psychological support sessions for the students. On the following Friday, everyone wore bright fluorescent green, neon green gloves, green shirts, and green woolen beanies. Some men and fathers looked eccentric wearing glowing green hunting vests with their massive wooden clogs and snow-stained jeans, but no one cared about appearances at that moment. The town's community center distributed small green ribbons fastened with metal pins, the tiny kind that pricks your finger if you don't handle it carefully. The exact same kind of pins Oliver used to hang his drawings on the school corkboard during every art exhibition. The church bells tolled forcefully and for longer intervals that winter, not to instill hope, but to remind us of our guilt and failure, of that mother who didn't answer her phone for a whole day when her child vanished, who waited a month and a half before anyone truly knew what happened to him, and who kept insisting that he was probably fine and elsewhere, and that he wasn't worth all this fuss and disruption, until the fuss finally found him as a cold corpse. We ended the year 1995 feeling completely numb. The town sign remained exactly the same, pointing to 1,500 residents, but a vibrant, glowing green spot had completely vanished, dissolving into the brickwork. No one allowed themselves to forget what happened. They still speak of him to this day, many years later, not as a ghost story to stir dread, but as a lesson driving them to offer extra care and attention to every strange, small, and silent child walking alone in the winter nights. The Nielsen family departed from the town by February of that year. They said goodbye to no one, nor did they share their new address with anyone. They faced no public legal punishment, but they received a condemnation and scorn from the community that was far heavier than any judicial sentence. That house remained abandoned for much longer than usual, and the chimney was sealed shut and tightly reinforced with iron sheets and sturdy steel bolts, not to prevent ghosts from escaping, but to sever any false hope or repetition of that tragedy. Some disasters do not fade, nor does time erase them. Instead, they grow sharper and clearer, ringing like an alarm bell. Yet lessons never heal wounds. They merely interpret them and explain their causes. The town still aches today. Some businesses closed, many residents left, and the streets have become louder and more crowded with strangers. 1,500 is a number the town never reached again, and we began to date events and measure time based on two eras: life before Oliver and life after Oliver. And the subsequent era was not easier or kinder. It was simply a heavier burden to bear. The ending is as clear as day, and it is not just a passing line, but a naked truth. Oliver did not run away from town, nor was he hiding out of a desire to be distant. Oliver took a wretched, wrong path because the doors closed and barred-in-your-face force you to make foolish and fatal choices. Oliver died an agonizingly slow death in the freezing cold of that lethal brick because the person who was supposed to give him love and safety abandoned him, leaving him with nothing but bad, dark entryways, and bad. Dark entryways in this life are often bad, lethal exits as well. This is the story. This is the scar carved into our hearts. And this is the bitter truth. Small towns never heal from the death of a fluorescent child who departed in absolute silence. They only learn how to carry the weight of this guilt together, even if the outside world never becomes any better afterward. I grew up in a remote coastal town nestled in the British county of Cornwall called Port Haven, a place where everyone knew the exact hum of the vintage street lamps and memorized the fractures in the stone pavements by heart. It was one of those towns where you could name every single family living in your entire block. Summer there always smelled of fried apple pies, hot asphalt, and the engine oil wafting from the annual fairground machinery that arrived on massive flatbed trucks in the middle of every July. It was a place where the occurrence of anything evil seemed utterly impossible, until the day that proved otherwise. When I was a child, the residents were still speaking of the missing boy, even though the incident had taken place many years before my birth. His name was printed on old, faded posters stapled to the wooden poles in the center of town. By the time I turned 8, the paper had yellowed completely, its edges curling and stained by rainwater, to the point that the small square reserved for his school photograph was barely visible. He was 8 years old, too, when he vanished. The exact same age I was when I last noticed the remnants of those tattered posters. The festival was the biggest event of the year, held right in the heart of town. Our town center was small indeed. A single main road cut straight through it, and everything else branched off like arteries. The festival would completely fill the parking lots, block off the small side streets, and swallow the town's public square, transforming ordinary days into roaring nights illuminated by colored bulbs, its grounds turning sticky from spilled sodas. It lasted for 3 days from Friday to Sunday, concluding with a spectacular fireworks display over the old grain silos just outside the town limits. 30 years ago, on the second night of the festival, the little boy vanished without a trace. People say it happened between 7:30 and 8 p.m., just as the sun had almost entirely dipped below the horizon, though the sky still held onto its last deep navy glow before turning into pitch blackness. The boy was holding a bright green balloon shaped like a small dragon. You can still find old festival photos and family albums where children stand posing with that exact same dragon balloon. Vendors sold them every year as a tradition that never stopped, even after the story became a deep, unhealed wound in the body of the town. The town's police force at the time consisted of a local warden, 2 deputies, and a woman working the front desk to answer radio dispatches. There were no advanced surveillance cameras, no facial recognition technologies, and no digital registries. The corners around the spinning rides and the Ferris wheel were dark in that era, and the shadows hung thick behind the food stalls. This made vanishing amidst crowds that otherwise felt entirely safe terrifyingly easy. Witnesses later said they saw a man near the boy just before his disappearance. He wasn't a stranger. Rather, he was their neighbor who lived in the red brick house adjacent to theirs, a property distinguished by a small gravel driveway and a back porch that groaned sharply in the winter cold. The suspect's father and the missing boy's father were close friends, They shared work tools, evening chats, and hunting trips in nearby woods. The kind of friendship built on borrowing lawnmowers and sincere, small-town handshakes. The little boy used to constantly run into his yard because everyone trusted him blindly. When they arrested him, he confessed immediately. There was no mystery to the trial, no sudden plot twist, just a cold confession that shook the town to its foundations. The details were so profoundly hideous that adults to this day refuse to utter them aloud, describing it simply as the worst thing that ever happened here. That single confession altered every summer that followed. Parents began holding their children's wrists with a tighter, fiercer grip, and the taste of fried pies and sugary drinks took on a sudden bitterness in the throat. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison. For most towns, this would have been the end of the narrative. The case would be closed in the archives with a sigh of relief, buried beneath the dust of time like anything else that fades away. But not here. The laws during that period were different, and the legal loopholes were wider than logic. After serving only 8 years, the man secured a parole release. There was no relocation to another city, no protective exclusion zones, and no mandatory distances enforced. He returned to walk the streets of the town, wearing a gray hooded sweatshirt and worn-out, scuffed shoes. He moved right back into the same red brick house with his elderly parents. The exact same porch, the same garden, and the same wooden fence he once leaned against to make small talk with the victim's father. The elders claimed that his return was like watching a black storm cloud roll back into the sky, just as the earth had begun to forget the shape of rain. The house next door was still occupied by the missing boy's family. They had never left. Some say it was grief that froze the family's steps, while others claim it was a silent, simmering hostility determined to see justice done. When he returned, the patch of grass separating the two homes looked like an invisible border, sharp, jagged, and screaming with silence. No one spoke to him. The streets became cold and deserted the moment he passed through them, as though an unplanned curfew had suddenly been imposed. He was supposed to report to the parole office to prove his attendance every single morning. The office was an old, brown brick building situated near the railroad tracks, which still stands today with its windows permanently half-shrouded by blinds and a recycling bin outside that reeks of damp cardboard after the rain. I have passed by that office thousands of times, and every single time I do, the details flood back into my mind. About a week after his return, the man stopped showing up. He did not arrive at the office that morning. On that day, the police radios crackled back to life. The voices tight with a surprise that didn't actually feel like a surprise. It felt as though destiny was simply rearranging itself back into its proper course. His parents filed a missing person report before noon. The report itself has become a matter of public record now, whispered about in gatherings more than it is read. They described him in it as any frightened parents would: his height, weight, the color of his hoodie, and the last time he was seen. It was a bizarre attempt to simulate normalcy after a tragedy the size of the festival. I was 13 years old when I first heard the rumor of what had happened to him. Rumor is a polite word to describe something that everyone believes implicitly without anyone confirming it out loud. They say that the friends of the missing boy's father were the ones who took care of it. It wasn't shadows or ghosts, nor was it the police or the law, just fathers and uncles who had carried grief for longer than they had ever carried a weapon, and whose bonds of loyalty were sharper than any penal code. They say it happened at night. No screams were heard. No tires left skid marks on the tarmac. None of the town's domestic animals fell into a sudden panic, and there were no late-night phone calls. Just a man who vanished as though he had been completely erased from a photograph. When you walk down his street now, you see the red brick house, but it looks abandoned even though it isn't. The windows are clean but entirely devoid of life. The fence is painted every spring, but the wood derives no joy from the fresh coat. The neighbors mow their lawns, but his front yard remains wild. Not chaotic, but untouched, like land left to heal itself without any human interference. The festival continued to run every year. They never stopped it. Fried food, cheap prizes, and stuffed whales dangling from cords. The exact same massive bolts on the Ferris wheel were tightened and secured by the exact same workers who knew nothing of the old confessions. Children still carry balloons, but no longer the ones shaped like dragons. The green dragon balloon quietly vanished from the vendor's merchandise lists many years ago, without any formal announcement, without any objection, just a slow, gradual removal that everyone collectively agreed upon without ever needing to speak a word. Life in the town moved forward, but in a different manner, safer, quieter, and much heavier. By the time I turned 18, the old men who had been friends with the boy's father had aged considerably, but they still walked through the town center with backs straight enough to carry heavy secrets. Their boots were always dusty, even after the rain, and their coats reeked of metal and wood smoke. When curious teenagers or visiting hikers ask about the man who returned on parole and then suddenly disintegrated into thin air, these old men do not spin dramatic tales. They do not boast. Their tongues do not slip with details. The rhythm of their breathing never alters, and they do not shift uncomfortably in their seats or weave intricate lies. They merely look at you with absolute, unyielding certainty and say a few words, like telling you they know he won't be coming back and that they are sure of it. That certainty feels carved rather than spoken, like a headstone with no name written upon it. As I grew older, I studied psychology for a time, and I learned that human beings confess to crimes driven by guilt, fear, or coercion. But I also learned that silence can sometimes be infinitely more powerful than any confession. For silence tells you the entire story without ever risking the price of words. Do I truly know what happened to him? No. No one possesses proof. There are no files, no witness statements, and no truth signed on paper. But in this town, belief does not require evidence. Belief grows in the empty spaces between the street lamps, in the dead distance separating the two neighboring houses, and in the unspoken tension of winter nights that smell of fence paint and old wood. And since the story did not end with the sentencing, nor with the parole, nor with the disappearance, the true ending became the town itself. The ending became the warning, the adaptation, and the collective exhale that lasted for decades. The man never returned, not after his absence from the parole office, and not after the rumors solidified into a fixed certainty. The case technically remains open on paper somewhere deep in the police logs, but it is completely closed in the minds of the inhabitants of every house, shop, school corridor, and festival ticket booth. The conclusion is this: the man is gone forever, the town remains standing, the family kept their home, and the festival kept its colored lights. Justice here does not wear an official badge. It wears the quiet voice of people who have lived long enough for their weight to outweigh the monster. And if you try to press them for more, they content themselves with a smile holding that same deep-rooted truth. He won't return, and we are sure of it. That is the end of the story, clear and stretching out like the line of street lamps that leads out of town, where the horizon absorbs the noise and the silence finally gets the last word. A severe fever struck me before the expedition could even properly begin. The repercussions of a long flight from Chicago to Iceland had exhausted my body in ways I hadn't anticipated. My throat burned as if someone had run a piece of coarse sandpaper over it, and my chest let out a muffled rattle with every breath. By the time the plane touched down, I was coughing into my jacket sleeve every few minutes, trying by all means not to look as sick as I felt inside. The air in the capital, Reykjavik, was thick with sea moisture and dense fog, but that part of the journey was behind us now. We were now inside the 4x4, moving east across the rugged roads and mountain passes of the East Fjords Peninsula, in places where the sky appeared so vast and monolithic that the earth beneath it seemed minuscule and forgotten. I had always been captivated by remote, tiny fishing villages, the ones with wooden signs at their entrances that looked hand-painted by trembling fingers, the local shops that had kept the same battered wooden benches for decades, and the filling stations that still hung an old brass bell above their doors. We used to call them whale villages as a sort of inside joke among us. The western counties had granted us vast expanses of sweeping, dry grass. while the Central Highlands caught us off guard with sudden blizzards and herds of wild reindeer running parallel to the highway. The northern forests offered the scent of pure pine, which made the burden of my cold feel a little less sharp and painful. But the moment we approached the borders of the SVK district, the atmosphere shifted entirely. The land stretched out silent, barren, and completely devoid of any signs of life. Dilapidated fences ran for miles with absolutely nothing behind them, and old fish-drying shacks leaned on their sides like ancient, weary animals broken by exhaustion. The radio stations began to vanish one by one from the display screen, until the speakers gave up entirely and released a static hiss. By the time we drew close to the outskirts of the Grindavik municipality, the sun looked equally tired and defeated. The clock read 5 p.m. at the onset of twilight, and the lighting was dim, golden, and deceptively normal. We were in desperate need of fuel and a place to spend the night. Our usual plan was simple and well-rehearsed. Find any cheap inn or campsite, pay a few kroner, grab a quick hot meal, and then sleep to wake up early. A predictable, safe, and comfortable routine. The town we found was the kind of place you might miss if you blinked just once. A single, narrow main road with a population sign indicating a tiny number. Maybe 120 residents or 95. The number didn't matter. It was minuscule enough to be swallowed by the desolate wilderness surrounding it. There was a single gas station, a small pub, a small square hotel with a sloped roof sagging in the middle, and a few scattered old buildings that looked as though they were waiting for a strong gust of wind to knock them down. Nothing else. No one walking the alleys, no stray dogs, no parked local trucks, and no car headlights moving on the side streets. Only the still hum of nature filled the voids. The twilight insects were waking up, the rustle of dry grass danced with the wind, and the distant metallic ticking echoed from the slowly cooling engines of cars we could not yet see. Our vehicle veered toward the gas station, and the crunch of gravel beneath the tires mingled with the remnants of the old, cracked asphalt. The fuel pumps were ancient, painted red in some bygone era of history, but weathering had turned them into a pale, chalky pink. The station building was a rectangle of yellowed concrete blocks, with a twisted, bent metal antenna rising from its roof like the stem of a withered flower. There was a small garage attached to the building, its wooden door dented and partially open, revealing a dark interior filled with engine maintenance tools hanging on the walls like the ribs of a dead animal's ribcage. The beverage cooler buzzed continuously behind the window pane, while the neon open sign flashed with a lazy, erratic rhythm. While I was filling the car's tank, the rest of the crew walked in slow circles, stretching their legs and rubbing their faces to shake off the sleep and fatigue of the long journey. No one spoke. The town made talking seem futile, as if it rejected any kind of noise. My throat was still burning like fire, so I preferred to keep my mouth shut anyway. I felt dry dust particles clinging to my windpipe every time I tried to stifle a cough. I remember that moment like a still photograph that suddenly began to move. There was a small window on the side of the station store, partially obscured by a drooping curtain that was open just enough to reveal the inside corner of a room I assumed was a canned goods storeroom. The place was dark, stacked with boxes, and looked somewhat damp. Then a movement occurred. Just a fleeting glimpse. A human silhouette smaller than adult size darted toward the far corner. A shaven head and extremely pale skin that caught a sliver of the fading daylight. The frame resembled a child's body, but it was contorted in a way I couldn't explain at the time. The shoulders were eerily still, and the posture was hunched, as if hiding were an ingrained habit rather than a temporary reflex. The moment my eyes locked with it, the head jerked upward rapidly. The figure retreated backward, plunging into the pitch darkness with a swiftness that left no room for doubt or the pretense that I was hallucinating. It saw me, and it knew I had caught a glimpse of its presence. This knowledge made the surrounding silence feel not like an ordinary void, but like a bated, expectant breath. I didn't enter the store after that, and neither did any of my companions. We all silently agreed that buying snacks could wait. My friends seemed to stare at the surrounding buildings as if discovering their existence for the first time, even though they had been crouching there all along. The horizon was slowly dropping around the town like a trap quietly closing. It reminded me of movie scenes where the camera focuses long and hard on a dusty silence before a violent event unfolds. But this wasn't a cinema screen, and that precisely is what made it more terrifying. Real towns shouldn't look like a stage prearranged set. We got back into the car, the doors shutting behind us with a heavy thud, and the tires rolled past the first 2 blocks until we found ourselves entering the parking lot of the only diner in this area, a place called Hans Inn. The diner's exterior sign was made of metal, a faded blue color, bearing letters that had been white in the past, but the harsh climate had turned them the shade of ancient bones. The restaurant was low and sprawling, a slender structure with a cracked front doorstep and windows fogged at the edges by accumulated grease and time. There were only 2 cars in the lot, 2 old sedans, the kind that looked so clean it prevented you from saying they were broken down, yet too old to be modern. They weren't luxury cars, but they were preserved and maintained in a strange way that aroused suspicion compared to the decay surrounding them. From the outside, the diner appeared vibrant with life. Overlapping loud voices, the clatter of knives on plates, and the creaking of wooden chairs. The sound suggested warmth, like any small-town pit stop where locals wind down their day. My stomach churned because something in this scene did not align at all with the dead street behind us. But hunger pushes logic aside. We needed food before heading toward the glacial mountains the next day. The crew formed a spontaneous line behind me as we advanced toward the door. The sound cut off completely the exact instant we stepped inside. It didn't fade gradually. It snapped as if someone had pressed the mute button for the entire town. Every head turned toward us in the same frozen microsecond. The diner was crowded in a way the exterior could never have predicted. Long tables filled every corner. Heavy boots scuffed the floor, and dark winter jackets hung on wall hooks. Weather-beaten faces, young and old, all carried the exact same expression, flat, cold, and assessing features, as if they were measuring something invisible surrounding our bodies. Cups were raised halfway to mouths, spoons were frozen in midair, and dozens of conversations were severed in the exact same shared second, as if the entire room were a single organism reacting to the entry of a foreign body. At first, I thought they might just be curious. Travelers rarely pass through here, but ordinary glances of curiosity move, blink, and turn away after a moment. These stares, however, remained fixed, their eyes glassy and unblinking. Their bodies leaned forward slightly, but not out of welcome, rather out of anticipation. It was the kind of look people give when they know something you don't. When a mistake steps through the door, and they're trying to assess whether they should correct it or let it run its course to the very end. In the booth directly opposite the door sat an old woman. Her back was permanently stooped, that bend acquired after decades of hard labor and continuous bending. Her hair was thin and white as snow, and she wore a faded gray cotton dress, something between church attire and the clothes worn to feed livestock at dawn. She didn't move at first. Then her head turned with a speed far slower than her age should have allowed. Her movement was incredibly dragging and deliberate, as if designed to draw attention and to make the air grow heavy and tight around that moment. 2 black patches of cloth rested over her face, covering both of her eyes entirely, secured by a single elastic band wrapping around her head. I couldn't see her eyes, but I could feel their piercing intensity from beneath the patches, like holes being drilled into my flesh. Her voice was low, but it carried a harsh rasp like gravel scraping inside a tin can. Ancient vocal cords that had spent far too much time in the dust. The question she posed fell unbalanced into this absolute silence. What are you looking for here? The question wasn't about food or orders. It was about our right to exist inside this space. The concept was clear and absolute without the need for further explanatory words. I heard nothing after that except the roar of survival instinct within me. My body turned toward the exit before logic had enough time to formulate a single sentence. My friend's boots skidded behind me, and not one of them waited to interpret the tone or the words. We were already running with all the strength we possessed. The outer door burst open violently, and the cold evening air hit our faces like a pure antidote for the lungs. We scrambled back into the car, hands shaking, keys clattering against each other to unlock the doors faster than life had moved inside that diner. The engine roared to life, and the tires shrieked, leaving erratic tracks over the gravel. We didn't slow down at intersections because the town barely contained any. We pointed the car toward the ring road surrounding the peninsula, just as migratory animals head toward water sources. As we sped away, that little town began to shrink in the rearview mirror until it looked like any other insignificant speck of civilization. Just buildings, just signs, and just the end of a bad, terrifying pit stop. My cold returned to assert itself with brutal reality, roaring in my body after fear and adrenaline had briefly pushed it aside. My throat was still burning, but that burning was definitive proof of life. I was alive enough to choke on the air, and alive enough to escape a place etched so sharply in memory to be innocent or harmless. We didn't stop driving until the nature of the surrounding trees changed, and until the roads began to look like they belonged to open, natural lands, not a dark trap guarding a locked secret. Hour after hour, the highway pulled us north and west, away from that isolated spot in Iceland, until the daylight surrendered entirely to the darkness of night, and the stars no longer seemed like witnesses to our ordeal, but returned to being just stars again. Eventually, we crossed the border into the towering mountainous regions. The air became crisper, the trees grew taller, and the mountains gathered on the horizon like good, slow guardians instead of that lurking, oppressive silence. For days on end afterward, the most frightening shapes we saw were wild bears moving through the distant forests and thick clouds dragging their heavy shadows over the volcanic rocks. Nothing supernatural, nothing prearranged, just nature practicing its nature, wild but clear, dangerous but fair and just. That moment in SVK stayed with us long after the county borders ended. We talked about how a town this small could contain such a massive number of people inside a single diner, unless that place was the only beating social heart for several miles around. We guessed that it might be a town where strangers were viewed as a genuine threat. Perhaps they had faced trouble with previous visitors in the past, and maybe that collective stare was a defensive mechanism rather than an intention to cause harm. We also tried to find a rational explanation for the old woman, thinking she might have worn both patches for medical reasons or due to an old injury that had claimed her sight. But all those rationalizations were unable to erase the deep psychological impact of that moment. For humans can be far more terrifying than ghosts because they are real, and because fear doesn't need visible claws to perform its lethal function. The journey continued without any similar incidents after that. We traveled through valleys and under clear, gentle skies, and we camped under the weight of a heavier, cold smelling of pine resin and dewy earth, not engine exhaust. We drove until the mountains swallowed the horizon in ways that made the heart soar with joy and comfort, rather than shrink in terror. And when we finally reached the depths of the Icelandic highlands, the peace we felt seemed well-deserved. Not a false peace like the movies, and not the suspended, suspicious silence of the diner, but a real peace, the kind that tells you the danger has now transformed into just a story to be told, rather than a threat we live in the present. Years later, I still remember that in the buzz of a neon sign, the precise silence imposed at the exact right moment, and the coordinated collective stare. But the memory stops and ends at the highway, where we manage to outrun the confusion and escape with our lives. And that part is the most important of all, for the ending here is not an ongoing mystery, but survival, continuous forward motion, the vast distances we covered, and lungs that still function and breathe even through sickness, and a long, winding road that brought us back to the ordinary, natural wilderness, where strange occurrences remain mere passing moments and never grow to turn into something worse and more bloody.